She came to this town to be a wife. She stayed to save it from itself. Greta Falcon had 11 weeks to pay off a debt she didn't owe, in a town that didn't want her, beside a man who'd already half given up. The powerful Victor Kane had his lawyers ready, his patience thin, and his eyes fixed on every stick of timber that Jonas Mercer owned. What Kane didn't count on, what nobody counted on, was a 26-year-old immigrant woman who showed up with flour in her bag and absolutely no intention of quietly disappearing. This is her story. Stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach came into Quartz Ridge at 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon, and it arrived the way everything arrived in that town, kicking up dust, smelling faintly of misery, and announcing itself with a noise that made the horses tied outside Mercer's saloon shift nervously against their posts. Greta Falcon pressed her face to the scratched window glass and looked out at the town she was about to marry into. It wasn't much. A single main street that ran maybe 400 yards before it gave up and dissolved into scrubland. A hardware store with a sagging roof. A barber shop. A feed store. A dry goods merchant whose front window displayed 3 sun-bleached bolts of fabric and a hand-lettered sign that said, "Credit extended. God willing." A church at the far end of the street, white paint peeling in long strips like sunburned skin, and there, near the middle of everything, a 2-story building with a wooden sign that read Mercer's Saloon burned into a plank above the door, the letters uneven, the wood cracked along the grain. That was her destination. Greta sat back. The man across from her, a cattle buyer from somewhere east who'd talked for 3 hours straight about the price of beef, was watching her with the particular expression men used when they were preparing to offer unsolicited advice. "Quartz Ridge," he said, as if confirming something terrible. "Yes?" she said. "You got family here?" "A fiancé." He nodded slowly, the way a doctor nods when the diagnosis isn't good. "What does he do?" "He runs the saloon." The cattle buyer said nothing after that, which told her more than anything he might have said. Jonas Mercer was not waiting at the stage stop. This was not a surprise, exactly. He'd written in his last letter that he might be delayed, that Thursday afternoons got busy, that she should come directly to the saloon when she arrived and ask for him. But standing in the dust with her 2 bags and her hat box and the cattle buyer watching her from the window as the stage pulled away, Greta felt the particular loneliness of arriving somewhere new without anyone on the other end of it. She picked up her bags and walked. The street was quiet in that afternoon way of frontier towns. Most people inside, avoiding the heat, the saloon doing whatever business it did at this hour. A woman in a brown dress watched from the porch of the dry goods store, not unfriendly, not friendly either, just watching. 2 boys ran past, chasing a dog. An old man sat in a chair outside the barber shop with his hat over his face, either sleeping or doing a very good impression of it. She pushed through the doors of Mercer's saloon. The smell hit her first. Stale beer, sawdust, something underneath both of those that she couldn't name, but that suggested long years of accumulated dissatisfaction. The room was dim, the windows small and dirty. 4 tables, only 2 occupied. A long bar along the left wall with bottles arranged behind it, in no particular order. A man she didn't recognize was wiping the bar with a rag that wasn't doing much good. "I'm looking for Jonas Mercer," she said. The bartender looked up. He had a face built for skepticism. "He's in the back." "Can you tell him Greta Falcon is here?" Something shifted in the bartender's expression. A small recalibration, like he was adjusting his opinion of something. He set down the rag and disappeared through a door behind the bar. She stood there. One of the men at the occupied tables glanced at her, then back at his drink. The other didn't look up at all. Jonas came through the door 30 seconds later and stopped when he saw her. He was taller than she'd expected. She'd built a picture from his letters, which were careful and grammatically correct, and told her almost nothing about what he actually looked like. He was maybe 34, with dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw that needed shaving, and the look of a man who'd been carrying something heavy for so long that he'd forgotten it was supposed to feel heavy. His shirt was clean, at least. He was wearing an apron. "Greta," he said. "Jonas." He crossed the room and they shook hands, which was possibly the most awkward thing that had happened to her in the past year, and the past year had included emigrating from Bavaria with $42 and a letter from a matchmaking service. "I meant to be at the stage stop," he said. It's fine. It's not fine. He picked up one of her bags before she could stop him. Come on, I'll show you the room. Makam. The room he'd prepared for her was on the second floor, above the saloon. It was small and clean, the bed made with what appeared to be military precision, a pitcher and basin on the dresser, a window that looked out over the back of the building toward a scrubby lot, and beyond that the edge of the territory stretching flat and enormous all the way to the mountains. It's nice, she said. It's not nice, Jonas said, but it's the best I've got right now. She turned from the window. He was standing in the doorway with his arms at his sides, and she could see in the set of his shoulders something that she'd only half read in his letters, a defeat that had settled in so gradually he no longer noticed it was there. She'd come a long way. She'd made a decision. She was going to ask the question directly. How bad is it? She said. He blinked. What? The debt. Your last letter was vague. I'd like to know how bad it actually is. Jonas was quiet for a moment. Then he came into the room, pulled the chair out from the small desk in the corner, and sat down. He folded his hands on the desk like a man about to confess something in a courtroom. 11 weeks, he said. I owe Victor Kane $1,200. I've been paying him in installments, but the last 2 months I fell short, and he added a penalty clause. If I don't have the full balance by the end of 11 weeks, he can take the building. Greta set her hatbox on the bed. And what does the saloon bring in right now? On a good week, $40, sometimes $50, mostly closer to $30. She did the math without speaking. It didn't work. Nothing about it worked. Who is Victor Kane? She asked. He owns the freight company, the grain warehouse, 3 of the buildings on this street. Jonas looked at his hands. He's been buying up property in Quartz Ridge for 4 years. I'm the last holdout on this block. He wants the saloon. He wants the land the saloon sits on. He's got plans to build a proper hotel. She looked around the room again. The plain walls, the good solid floor, the window with its enormous view of nothing and everything. Is the saloon the problem? She asked. Or is it the way the saloon is being run? Jonas looked up at her. Greta, I'm not criticizing. I'm asking a genuine question. He was quiet for a long time. Both, he said finally. Probably both. She spent the first 3 days watching. This was a habit she'd had since childhood. Her mother used to say that Greta looked at a room the way a cat looked at a room, taking inventory before committing to anything. She watched the saloon in the mornings when it was quiet and the bartender, whose name was Dale, she'd learned, Dale Hurst, 15 years with Jonas, loyal as a fence post and about as animated, mopped the floors and set out the day's supplies. She watched it in the afternoons when the first customers drifted in, mostly men from the rail crew working the line extension 3 miles east of town, dusty and tired and wanting something to numb the afternoon. She watched it in the evenings when it should have been busy and wasn't, when maybe a dozen men sat at the tables or the bar and drank with a kind of grim efficiency that had nothing to do with enjoyment. What she noticed in those 3 days was this. Nobody talked much. Nobody laughed. The men came in, drank, went quiet, left. It was the least social saloon she'd ever been in, and she'd grown up in a village in Bavaria where the Gasthäuser were basically community living rooms where people argued about everything from crop rotation to local politics until 2 in the morning. There was nothing here, just drink and silence and the slow passage of time. On the 4th morning, she found the kitchen. It was a small room behind the bar, meant for basic food service. Jonas offered a limited menu, hard-boiled eggs and pickled things, and the occasional cold sandwich, but it had a proper iron stove, and tucked in the back corner under a canvas tarp, a wood-fired baking oven that someone had built into the back wall years ago and clearly hadn't used in a long time. She pulled the tarp off. The oven was solid, well-made, thick fire brick lining the inside. She opened the door and looked in. Some ash at the bottom, nothing else. That doesn't work, Dale said from the doorway. Why not? Flue's blocked, I think. Nobody's used it in, I don't know, years. Who built it? Previous owner, German fellow. He used to make bread, I think, before Jonas bought the place. Greta spent the afternoon cleaning out the flue. It was not blocked. It just needed cleaning. Boy. She talked to Jonas that evening after closing. When Dale had gone home, and the last customer had shuffled out, and the saloon was quiet with that particular hollow quiet of a place that should have more people in it. She sat across from him at the bar and put her hands flat on the counter and said, "I want to bake bread." Jonas looked at her. "What?" "I want to use the back oven. I want to bake bread in the mornings and offer it with the meals. Real bread, not the hardtack thing Dale sets out." "Greta, I run a saloon." "I know what you run. I'm telling you what I want to add to it." He rubbed his face with one hand. "That's not what people come here for." "What do they come here for?" "To drink. They come here because there's nowhere else to go," she said. "I've watched for 3 days. They don't come here happy. They come here because they're tired, and the alternative is an empty bunk. That's not a saloon. That's a waiting room." Jonas said nothing. "I'm not asking to change everything," she said. "I'm asking to put bread in the oven. If it doesn't work, we've lost nothing but flour." He looked at the bar top for a while. Then he said, "Fine, the flour's in the storage room. Don't use too much of it." She was up at 4 in the morning. The stove needed time to heat, and the oven needed more time than that. She'd done this before. Her grandmother's kitchen in Bavaria, Friday mornings, the smell of wood smoke and rising dough that she associated so completely with safety and warmth that even thinking about it put a feeling in her chest she didn't have a word for in English. She mixed the dough by feel more than by measurement, the way her grandmother had taught her. Flour, water, salt, yeast she'd found at the back of the dry goods store. Old, but still good. She worked it on the floured counter until it had the right texture, then set it to rise near the stove's warmth. While it rose, she started a pot of proper coffee on the stove. Not the weak scorched stuff Dale made, but real coffee, dark and strong. The first loaf went into the oven at 6. By 6:30, the smell had reached the front of the saloon. By 7, the smell had reached the street. Dale came in at 7:15, stopped just inside the door, and stood there with his head tilted like a dog that heard something unexpected. "That's bread," he said. "Yes," Greta said from behind the bar, where she was setting out cups. He came around the bar and looked into the kitchen. She watched him from the doorway. He was looking at the loaf she'd set to cool on the counter, golden brown, cracked along the top the way a good loaf cracked, still steaming. "Jonas know about this?" he asked. "He approved it last night." Dale turned back to look at her. His expression was still largely unreadable, but something in it had shifted slightly. The skepticism was still there, but it had been joined by something else. Curiosity, maybe. Or the early stages of being won over, which in men like Dale often looked identical to skepticism until the very last moment. "That's a good-looking loaf," he said, which from him might as well have been a standing ovation. The first people to come in for the bread were the rail workers. They arrived around 8, 6 of them, still dirty from the overnight shift, looking for somewhere warm to sit. They ordered coffee, and Dale pointed at the basket of sliced bread Greta had set on the bar and said gruffly, "That's fresh, if you want it." One of the workers reached out and took a piece without much thought, just habit. Food's there, you take it. He ate it standing at the bar. He stopped moving for a moment when he tasted it. Then he said to nobody in particular, "That's actual bread." It sounds like a small thing, but the way he said it, the particular quality of his voice, somewhere between surprise and something closer to homesickness, made one of the other workers turn around and reach for a piece without asking. By 8:30, the basket was empty, and Greta had put 2 more loaves in the oven. She charged 3 cents a slice, which was less than she probably should have, but she was more interested in getting people used to stopping in than she was in maximizing the margin on day 1. The rail workers sat at 2 of the tables. Usually men like that drank and left. Today they sat. One of them asked if there was anything hot. She'd started a pot of bean soup, thinking ahead, and she said it'd be ready by 9, which is what it was. 2 of the workers came back the next morning and brought 3 others. By the end of the first week, the morning rush, she'd started thinking of it that way, as a real thing, a rush, had grown to include the rail workers, a handful of men from the livestock pens on the south end of town, and on Saturday morning, a ranchwoman named Helen Brody, who'd ridden in with her teenage son for supplies, and who walked past Mercer's saloon, stopped, came back, stood in the doorway for a moment, as if checking whether she was reading the situation correctly, and then came in. Helen Brody sat at the bar and ordered coffee and bread, and ate in the deliberate, appreciative way of someone who cooked for other people constantly and almost never had someone cook for them. She didn't say much, but when she left a nickel extra on the counter without being asked. Greta didn't say anything. She just put the nickel in the till. The following Saturday, Helen came back with her daughter. Burput, Jonas noticed. He'd have had to be actively trying not to notice. The mornings were louder, the till was heavier at the end of the week, and the kitchen, which he'd walked through 1,000 times without it mattering to him, now had something going on in it at all hours. He found her one Tuesday morning at 5:30, the oven already hot, Greta kneading a second batch of dough while the first sat rising. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a minute. "You're up early," he said. "Bread doesn't care what time it is," she said without turning around. He came in and stood at the counter. He watched her work. The way she moved was efficient and certain, no wasted motion, the dough responding to her hands like it was cooperating. "How much did we make last week?" he asked. "In the mornings? About $22. Bread, soup, coffee. Between Monday and Saturday. $22 was more than the evenings had brought in." Jonas was quiet for a moment. "Dale said you've been talking to the ranch families." "Some of them come in on market days," Greta said. "I told Helen Brody I could have fresh bread ready on Fridays if she wanted to buy a full loaf to take home." "And?" "She told her neighbor, and her neighbor told someone else." She turned around and looked at him directly. "Jonas, this building is warm in the morning and cold at night. The saloon business is night business, and right now you're losing the nights, but you could own the mornings." He looked at the loaves on the counter. He picked up a slice she'd set aside and ate it without ceremony. "It's good," he said. "I know it's good." A corner of his mouth moved. Almost a smile, but not quite. He was a man who'd been almost smiling for so long that the full version had gotten rusty. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. "Someone quieter." "My letters were quiet," she said. "I had a lot of time to think on the journey. I don't write the way I talk." He looked at her for another moment, then looked away. "I'll tell Dale to give you whatever you need from the stock." "I already told him that myself," she said. He laughed at that, actually laughed, short and surprised, and it changed his face entirely, took 10 years off him, made him look like someone she might actually enjoy knowing. He covered it almost immediately, but she'd seen it. "Right," he said. "Of course you did." The boy showed up on a Wednesday. He was maybe 11, small for his age, wearing clothes that had been washed too many times, and a pair of boots that didn't match. One brown, one black, both too big. He stood outside the saloon door for a long time before he came in, and when he did come in, he walked directly to the bar and stood there and said, "I can work." Dale looked at him over the bar. "For what?" "For food," the boy said. Greta came out of the kitchen. She looked at the boy. His face was thin, not sick thin, but hungry thin, the particular look of someone who'd been managing on not quite enough for long enough that it had started to show. "What's your name?" she asked. "Eli Turner." "Where do you live, Eli Turner?" "The relay station." He said it flatly, the way kids said things they'd already made peace with. "Old Pete Harker lets me sleep there. He used to know my father." "Where's your father?" "Dead. Last year. Railroad accident." "Your mother?" "Before that." She looked at him for another moment. He looked back at her steadily, not with defiance exactly, but with the particular self-possession of a child who's learned that asking for things with your eyes down doesn't work. "Can you carry things without dropping them?" she asked. "Yes." "Can you follow instructions the first time?" "Mostly." She almost smiled at the honesty of that. "Come around back," she said. Dale watched this exchange without comment. When the boy had followed Greta into the kitchen, Dale turned back to his bar wiping and said to nobody in particular, "Lord help us." Eli turned out to be useful in the way that children are sometimes useful. Not skilled exactly, but quick and attentive and willing. She had him carry wood for the stove in the mornings, wash the bread pans, carry trays out to the tables. He worked without complaint and ate with the focused intensity of someone who understood food as something more than fuel. After the first week, she told him to come back Monday. He was there when she came downstairs at 4:30. He'd already started the stove. "How did you know how to do that?" she asked. "Old Pete showed me," he said. "He heats the relay station the same way." She looked at him standing next to the stove in his mismatched boots, trying to look capable and mostly succeeding. Something tightened in her chest that she chose not to examine too closely. The fire's a little too high, she said. Turn the damper this way. He turned it. Better, she said. Now watch the dough and don't let it get too close to the heat. He stood there and watched the dough. She went to get the flour. Chum. By the 6th week, the mornings at Mercer's Saloon were a recognizable thing, something the town was starting to count on, the way it counted on the stage coming through on Thursdays. The rail crew came in shifts, the ranch families stopped on market days, and a handful of the town's regular residents, the school teacher, the blacksmith's wife, the man who ran the assay office, had developed the habit of stopping in before the day got going. The soup had expanded. In addition to the bean soup she'd started with, she was now making a vegetable broth on Tuesdays, a thick potato and salt pork stew on Thursdays. She'd found that if she kept the broth going on the back of the stove all day, the smell of it traveled out into the street, which was better advertising than anything you could put on a sign. The till was heavier, nowhere near enough to solve the problem of Victor Kane and $1,200 in 11 weeks that had become 6, but heavier than it had been. Jonas counted the week's take on Sunday evenings at the bar, and she sat across from him while he did it, and they talked through what the next week would need. The flour cost is going up, she said one Sunday. I'm using more than we budgeted. More flour means more bread means more money, he said. Yes, but I need to know the margin before I expand. I don't want to be selling more and making less. He looked up from the bills. You think about it like a business. It is a business. I know, most women I've known, they cook because they cook. They don't think about margins. She gave him a look that was patient, but with a limit somewhere visible. I left Bavaria with $42 and a letter from a matchmaking service, she said. I've been thinking about margins my whole life. He held up a hand. Fair point. I need $12 more per week in flour if I'm going to add a 4th morning soup. All right. And I want to buy a second bread pan. The one we have is too small for the Friday loaves. Also all right. She made a note in the small book she kept in her apron pocket. He watched her write it down. Greta, he said. She looked up. I should have... He stopped, started again. When you came here, I didn't make you feel particularly welcome. I know that. She set her pen down. You were worried. I was more than worried. He looked at the money on the bar, then away. I didn't think there was any way to save this place. I'd stopped trying, honestly. I was just going through the motions until Kane showed up with his paperwork. And now? He was quiet for a moment. Now I'm not sure, he said, which is better than knowing it's finished. She picked her pen back up. That's enough for now, she said, which was neither dismissal nor agreement, just the truth. It was toward the end of the 6th week that she met Victor Kane. He came in one Thursday morning, which surprised her. She'd expected him to arrive at a moment of drama, in the evening, with some kind of official notice. Instead, he walked through the door at 8:15 wearing a good suit that was too hot for the weather, looked around the room with the unhurried assessment of a man who was used to looking at things he owned, and sat down at the bar. He was maybe 50, heavy-set but not soft, with graying hair and the kind of face that had once been handsome and had settled into something more purposeful. He had a quality she recognized from her father's descriptions of certain merchants back home, a man who was always calculating something, always working out what a thing was worth. Coffee, he said. Dale poured it without comment. Kane looked around again, more slowly this time. The morning crowd was there. 6 rail workers, 2 ranch wives with their children, old Alton from the assay office with his newspaper. The room smelled of coffee and bread and the faint, sweet steam of the soup pot. Things have changed around here, Kane said, to Dale more than anyone. Some things, Dale said. Where's Mercer? He'll be down at 9. Kane picked up his coffee cup. His eyes moved to Greta, who was behind the bar setting out the bread basket. He hadn't introduced himself, but she knew who he was. You're the fiancé, he said. Yes, she said. From Germany. Bavaria. He nodded as if filing that away. My grandmother came from Hamburg. Different kind of people, the Germans. He said it in the tone of mild ethnic observation that was neither quite compliment nor quite insult. Hard-working. Most people are hard-working, she said, when they have to be. He looked at her steadily. She looked back. Nice smell, he said, nodding at the kitchen. Thank you. Jonas tells me you've been experimenting with the business model. We've been baking bread, she said. It's not an experiment. A small smile moved across his face. Not a warm one, just an acknowledgement that she'd said something he hadn't expected. 11 weeks is a tight window, Miss Falcon. I know the window, she said. Good. He finished his coffee and set the cup down and stood. I just wanted to make sure we understood each other. He put a coin on the bar, a full quarter, substantially more than the coffee cost, and walked out. Dale watched the door close. Then he looked at Greta. Well, he said. Well, she agreed. She picked up the quarter and put it in the till. And set. The nights were different. The mornings were hers. She'd built them from nothing, and she understood them. But the evenings, the actual saloon business, the drinking crowd that was supposed to be Jonas's bread and butter, those were struggling in a way that had nothing to do with her bread. She noticed it at the end of the 6th week when the Friday evening take was $31, which was the same as it had been in the 2nd week, unchanged despite everything she'd added in the mornings. The morning money was new money, good money, but it wasn't enough on its own, and the evenings weren't growing. She asked Dale about it on a Saturday morning. He took a while to answer, which was his way. He wiped the bar. He arranged the glasses. Finally, he said, Kane's been talking. What's he saying? That Jonas has gone soft, that this place isn't what it used to be, that real men don't want to sit in a bakery. He said the last word with quotation marks around it that she could practically hear. She absorbed this. Is it working? Some, Dale said. Some of the regular evening men have been going to the other place. What other place? Kane opened a billiards room last month on the far end of the block. Cheaper whiskey. He brought in a couple of men from... Dale paused, looking for the right word. A couple of men from the kind of establishment that attracts other men. She understood. And you didn't tell me. Didn't want to worry you, Dale said, which was kind and also completely wrong. Dale, she said, I need to know everything that's happening. The worrying I can handle. What I can't handle is making decisions without information. He looked at her, that long, assessing look, and then nodded once. All right, he said. From now on. Good. She folded her dish towel. Now tell me the rest. He told her the rest. Jonas was in the back office when she found him that afternoon. He was looking at numbers. She could see from the door that he'd been going over the accounts, the ledger open in front of him, a glass of whiskey beside it that was more than half empty for mid-afternoon. She came in and sat across from him. You knew about the billiards room, she said. He didn't look up right away. Yes. How long? 3 weeks. She waited. I didn't know how to tell you, he said. You've been working so hard on the mornings, and it's been going well, and I didn't want to... He stopped. Ruin my mood? She said, not harshly. Something like that. She looked at the ledger. Even without reading it, she could see the shape of the problem. The numbers in the wrong column were thicker than the numbers in the right one. How much time do we actually have? She asked. At the current rate? We'll be short by maybe $300-400 when the deadline comes. $300 or $400 on top of whatever they had. $340 if it was 3, $400 and something if it was 4. Against the $1,200 total, against the morning income, against the evenings that weren't growing. She ran the numbers in her head the way she'd learned to run numbers, the way you learned when the stakes were real. It was possible, just barely possible, but only if something changed. We need the evenings to come back, she said. I know. And we need them to come back in a way Kane can't undercut by opening another room with cheaper whiskey. I know that too, he said. I just don't know how. She was quiet for a while. Outside, the afternoon light was shifting, the long shadows of early evening starting to reach across the floor. She was thinking about the oven, about the smell of bread that traveled down the street, about Helen Brody coming back the second Saturday with her daughter, about Eli Turner standing at the stove at 4:30 in the morning, watching the damper like it mattered. She was thinking about what she'd seen in this town in 6 weeks. Not the drinking men in the evenings, but the other things. The ranch wives who ate at the bar with the particular relief of someone getting a rest from their own kitchen. The rail workers who stayed an extra half hour because the soup was still hot and they didn't want to go back to camp. The school teacher who came in alone on Wednesday mornings and sat at the corner table and read for 40 minutes and didn't talk to anyone, just sat in the warmth and the smell of coffee and bread, and was, for 40 minutes, not lonely. She was thinking about what a town was actually starving for. "Jonas," she said. He looked up. "I want to talk about something bigger." He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the ledger. He picked up his whiskey glass and then set it back down without drinking from it. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. And she told him what she was thinking. What Greta proposed was not complicated. That was the part Jonas kept coming back to afterward. How simple it actually was once she laid it out. She wanted to open the evenings to families, not replace the drinking crowd, not chase off the men who came in after a long day wanting a whiskey and somewhere to sit. Just add to it. Tables set up for families on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, proper meals at a proper price, the soup and bread she was already making extended into something more substantial. Stew, roasted potatoes, salt pork with greens when she could get them. "Kane's billiards room draws men who want to drink and gamble," she said. "We can't compete with that. We shouldn't try. But he's not offering anything for the families, the ranch wives, the workers with children, the people who want a hot meal and a table that isn't their own kitchen. There's nobody serving them." Jonas leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a while. Quartz Ridge has never had a family restaurant. "I know. People might not come." "They might not," she said. "But the women will. And where women go, families follow. And where families go, the town follows." He was quiet for a long moment. She could see him doing what she'd watched him do a dozen times in the past 6 weeks. The slow internal negotiation between the part of him that wanted to try and the part of him that had been burned enough times to be suspicious of wanting anything. "The evenings are already struggling," he said finally. "Yes, so the risk is limited." "That's one way to think about it." He looked at her. "What's your way?" "My way is that we have 5 weeks left and this is worth trying." She paused. "Jonas, I wouldn't suggest it if I didn't think it would work." He considered that. She'd been right about the mornings, and he knew it. That counted for something. "Tuesday," he said. "We try it Tuesday evening." The first family evening was not a triumph. 4 people came. Eli's informal guardian, old Pete Harker, who was not technically a family but had nowhere else to be on a Tuesday, and the Brody family, Helen and her husband Frank and their 2 children, who arrived punctually at 6 and sat at the table Greta had set near the window with a checked cloth she'd bought at the dry goods store that afternoon. Jonas stood behind his bar with his arms folded and watched with the expression of a man bracing for confirmation of his worst fears. But Helen Brody ate her stew and told her daughter to sit up straight and told her husband to stop looking at the door like he was expecting something bad. And Frank Brody, who was a large, quiet man with calloused hands and the deliberate speech of someone who chose words carefully, said to Jonas across the room, "This is good stew, Mercer." "Greta made it," Jonas said. Frank Brody nodded and went back to eating. After they left, Jonas counted the evening's take. $6.40 from the family table, 17 from the regular drinkers at the bar. "It's not enough," he said. "It's the first night," Greta said. "We need more than $6 a Tuesday." "We need more than 4 families," she said. "Give it 2 weeks." He gave it 2 weeks. By the second Tuesday, there were 3 tables. By the third, 5. Helen Brody had talked to someone who talked to someone. The mechanism of word of mouth in small towns worked differently from cities, more slowly but more thoroughly, the way water found its way through rock. By the end of the second week, the Thursday evening was drawing $8 from family tables alone, and the men at the bar seemed to have made their peace with the changed atmosphere, or some of them had, anyway. A few had stopped coming, drifted toward Kane's billiards room, but the ones who stayed seemed to find the new arrangement either neutral or faintly pleasant, the way men sometimes find domestic noise pleasant when they've been away from it for a while. Eli had taken to working the evening shift too without being asked. He cleared plates, carried bread baskets, refilled coffee. He'd stopped needing to be told how to do things after the first week, which freed Greta to stay in the kitchen and focus on the food. She watched him sometimes from the kitchen doorway, his careful way of setting things down, the way he paid attention to whether people needed something before they asked. He was good at it, better than she'd expected from a child. "You like working here," she said to him one Thursday after close. He shrugged. "It's warm." "That's all?" He thought about it with the seriousness he brought to everything. "I like when people like the food," he said. "When they eat it and their face changes." She knew exactly what he meant. "That's the best part," she said. He nodded, satisfied to have been understood. The rumor reached her through Helen Brody, who was not a woman given to gossip, but also not a woman who believed in letting useful information sit idle. She came in one Friday morning earlier than usual, sat at the bar, and waited until Greta had finished with the bread and came around to pour the coffee. Then she said quietly, "I heard something yesterday you should know." Greta sat across from her. "Victor Kane had dinner at the Dolan house Wednesday evening," Helen said. "Margaret Dolan told my sister-in-law. Kane was saying that Jonas Mercer has lost his mind, letting a foreign woman run his business into the ground, that the place has gone soft." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "He's been saying it to anyone who'll listen. That real men don't want bread and soup, that a saloon that smells like a bakery isn't fit for the territory." Greta said nothing, just let Helen finish. "Margaret said some of the men from the rail camp have been listening, the rougher ones. Night before last, 3 of them went to the billiards room instead of here." Helen looked at her directly. "I'm not telling you this to frighten you. I'm telling you because you should know who's pulling strings." "I already knew it was Kane," Greta said. "Knowing it and knowing the shape of it are different things." Helen picked up her coffee. "He's not just competing with you. He's trying to embarrass Jonas specifically. Make the men in town think Jonas has gone soft by letting his woman run things. That's the story he's selling." The specific cruelty of that landed somewhere in Greta's chest and stayed there. It wasn't about the business. It was about Jonas's standing among the men of the town, something more fragile and more important than money, in a place like Quartz Ridge. "Has Jonas heard this?" she asked. "I don't know. Maybe." After Helen left, Greta sat at the bar alone for a few minutes before the morning crowd started filtering in. She was thinking about what it meant. Not the rumor itself, but the effect of it, the way it would work on Jonas's mind, the particular weakness it was designed to exploit in a man who'd already been struggling with doubt before she ever arrived. She thought about the evenings, the bar crowd getting thinner, the numbers that were better than before but still not what they needed. She thought about 5 weeks. She found Jonas in the kitchen that afternoon, which was unusual. He didn't come into the kitchen much, had a kind of unconscious respect for it as her territory in a way that she found both considerate and slightly frustrating, because it meant they didn't talk enough. He was standing at the back counter, looking at nothing in particular. "You heard," she said. He turned. He didn't ask how she knew he'd heard. "Dale told me this morning. One of the railmen said something to him last night." "What exactly did he say?" Jonas's jaw worked for a moment. That Jonas Mercer had turned his saloon into a tea house for women and children. He said it flatly, repeating it the way you repeated something to get the poison out of it. "That Kane's place is where the real business happens." "Is that what you think?" she asked. "It doesn't matter what I think." "Jonas, what matters is what they think," he said, louder than he'd meant to. He caught himself, lowered his voice. "Greta, I've been in this town for 8 years. I know these men. If they decide this place is soft, there's no getting that back." "Or," she said, "if they decide this place is something better, there's no taking that back either." "That's a nice thought." "It's not a thought. It's what I've watched happen for 6 weeks." She wasn't raising her voice, but the steadiness of it had an edge. "The men who come in the mornings, the rail crew, the hands from the Whitfield Ranch, they keep coming back. Not because the coffee is free, it isn't, but because they feel like something here is real. Kane's billiards room has cheaper whiskey and women and pool tables. Fine. He can have that. He can't replicate what we have here." "And what's that?" Jonas asked, genuinely. She thought for a moment. "That somebody gives a damn," she said. He looked at her. She held it. "You're not angry," he said, as if just noticing this. "I'm furious," she said. "I'm just not going to let it make me stupid." That almost smile again, the one that went to his eyes before he caught it. "Kane thinks you're easy to beat," he said. "I know he does." "Are you?" "What do you think?" He looked at her for another moment, and then he did something he hadn't done in 6 weeks of working alongside each other in closer quarters than either of them had anticipated. He said, plainly and without hedging, "I think he's badly underestimated you." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't romantic. It was just a man saying what he actually believed, which in her experience was rarer and worth more than most declarations. "Then let's not prove him right," she said. The night the trouble came, she was still awake. It was a Tuesday, the fourth family evening, and it had gone well. 9 tables, the best yet, and the bar had been respectably busy alongside it, the two crowds existing in the same room in that slightly awkward but functional way that was becoming normal. She'd been in the kitchen until 10, then helped Dale close, then sat at the bar going over the week's accounts while Jonas locked up. She was still at the bar at 11:30, the accounts in front of her, when she heard the voices outside. Loud voices. Men who'd had enough to drink to stop caring about volume. She recognized one of the voices, a man named Creed, who worked the rail camp and had been a regular in the first weeks before Kane's billiards room opened, one of the ones who'd drifted away. She didn't recognize the others. Jonas came downstairs at the noise. He and Greta stood at the window and looked out. 4 men on the porch, not trying to come in, just standing there, talking loudly about the place in terms that weren't polite, making a performance of it for each other the way drunk men did when they wanted an audience, even if the audience was just themselves. "They'll move on," Jonas said. "Probably," Greta said. One of the men picked up a rock from the street and threw it at the saloon sign. It hit the wood with a crack that made both of them flinch. The men laughed. Jonas moved toward the door. "Don't," Greta said. "They're throwing rocks at my sign." "I know, but going out there angry won't fix anything and might make it worse." She looked at him. "They want a reaction. Don't give it to them." He stopped at the door, hand on the frame. She watched the back of his neck, the tension there, the particular stillness of a man working very hard not to do what he wanted to do. The men outside kept laughing. Another rock, smaller, hit the window frame. "Jonas," she said, softer. "I know." He stood there another moment. Then he took his hand off the door frame and came back to the bar and sat down heavily on a stool. Outside, the men eventually ran out of entertainment and moved on. The saloon was quiet. After a while, Dale came in through the back. He'd heard the noise from his room above the hardware store next door. He looked at the window, then at Jonas, then at Greta. "Kane sent them," he said. It wasn't a question. "Almost certainly," Greta said. Dale went and looked out at the sign. The rock had cracked the wood along the R in Mercer's. He stood there looking at it for a moment with his back to them. "That's a cheap trick," he said. "It worked on the neighbors," Jonas said. "Martin at the feed store told me this afternoon that his wife doesn't want them going anywhere near this block after dark." Greta wrote something in her accounts book. Then she looked up. "Do you have a spare plank?" she asked Dale. He turned. "In the back." "Yeah. Tomorrow morning I want to fix the sign, and I want to make it bigger." She looked at both of them. "If Kane wants people to think this place is dying, I want them to see it thriving instead." The new sign went up Saturday morning, and Dale did the lettering himself, which surprised everyone, including Dale, who turned out to have learned the skill from a sign painter in his first town, and hadn't used it in 20 years. The letters were clean and even, and the plank was fresh-cut pine, bright against the weathered face of the building. A woman named Carla Ostrowski, who ran the seamstress shop 2 doors down, watched them put it up from her porch, and then came over and said to Greta, "I heard about the trouble Tuesday night." "It was nothing serious," Greta said. "It was serious enough," Carla said. She was a compact, direct woman, maybe 45, with ink-dark eyes and the accent of someone from the eastern cities who'd come west for reasons she hadn't shared with anyone. "Kane's been leaning on people for years. My lease is through his freight company. Every year it goes up a little, never enough to fight about, just enough to remind me who's holding the rope." She looked at the sign. "The sign looks good." "Thank you. I sent my niece to your Tuesday dinner last week. She said the stew was the best she'd eaten since her mother's table." Greta looked at her. "Tell her to come back Thursday." Carla studied her for a moment, the way women sometimes studied other women, not competitively, but with a kind of measuring respect. "You're not going to let him run you out," she said. "No," Greta said. "I'm not." Carla nodded, one short nod that meant something she didn't put into words, and went back to her shop. But that night was bad. The Thursday evening take was $12 from the family tables, the best yet. The bar brought in $9. Together, $21, the best single evening since she'd arrived. And then Friday and Saturday evenings fell apart. She never found out exactly what was said or by whom, but the Friday crowd was thin. 6 men at the bar, no family tables because it wasn't a family night. Saturday was worse. $9 total for the evening, the worst in weeks. Dale said nothing about it, but she saw his face when he counted the drawer. Jonas didn't say anything either, but he was quieter that evening than he'd been in days. The silence of a man whose worry had returned and settled in the way a cold settled. Not sharp, just present, everywhere. She did the math on Sunday. 4 weeks left. At the current rate, they'd be short by more than she'd told herself, closer to $500 short. She sat with that number for a while. She'd been honest with herself from the beginning about what this was. A long shot dressed up as a plan. She'd believed in it, and she still believed in it, but belief didn't move money. The mornings were good. The family evenings were growing. But the evening drinking crowd was hemorrhaging to Kane's place, and the spread of his rumors was doing exactly what he'd designed it to do. She needed something that couldn't be stolen. Something that wasn't about competing with Kane at all. She was still sitting at the bar at midnight when Jonas came back down and found her there. "You should sleep," he said. "I'm thinking." He sat across from her. He looked tired in the particular way of someone who'd slept but not rested, the worry doing its work even in sleep. "I've been thinking too," he said, "and I want to say something." She looked at him. "What you've done here," he said, slowly, like he was choosing each word with care. "Since you came, the mornings, the families, Eli, what you've built here. I want you to know I see it. Whatever happens with the money, with Kane, what you've done is real." She was quiet for a moment. "It won't be enough if we lose the building," she said. "I know. I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying—" He stopped, started again. "I haven't been easy to work with. I know that. I gave up on this place before you got here, and you came in and you didn't give up, and that cost you. The nights with the rocks, the rumors, people saying things about whether you belong here." His voice had gone to something rougher. "I'm sorry for that." She looked at him for a long time. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the bar top, the way he did when he was saying something that cost him. "Jonas," she said. He looked up. "We're going to figure this out," she said, "but I need you to trust me a little further." Something moved across his face. Not relief exactly, but the first cousin of it. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," she said, "that we've been fighting Kane's battle, trying to win back the drinkers he took, trying to protect the evenings he's undermining, reacting to everything he does. That's because he keeps doing things. I know, and I want to stop reacting." She looked at him directly. "I want to do something so large that it changes the shape of the conversation entirely. Something that isn't about the saloon business at all." He waited. "I want to feed the whole town," she said. He stared at her. "One meal," she said. "The biggest community supper Quartz Ridge has ever seen. Free. Not to drive business, just to give people something. To show them what this place actually is." She paused. "And I want to do it in the last few days before the deadline." The silence between them was long. He was running the numbers, she could see it. The cost of the food, the flour, the time. And underneath the numbers, the larger question of whether it made any sense at all. "That'll cost money we don't have," he said. "I know. We can't afford to feed the whole town." "No," she said, not alone. He looked at her steadily, working it out. "You're going to ask people to help," he said. "I'm going to let people decide if they want to be part of something," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at the bar, at his hands, at her. 4 weeks, he said. 4 weeks, she agreed. He was quiet for another moment, then quietly, "Who do we ask first?" She almost smiled. "Helen Brody," she said. "She'll know everyone worth talking to." He nodded slowly. He reached out and picked up the pencil she'd left on the bar and turned it in his fingers. Just the small, unconscious motion of a man who was starting to think forward again, instead of backward. It was small, but she saw it. Helen Brody arrived Monday morning before the bread was out of the oven. Greta had sent word through Eli, a folded note delivered to the Brody Ranch at sundown Sunday. Nothing elaborate, just, "I need to talk to you, Monday morning if you can. Bring Frank if he's willing." Helen came alone, which was fine. Frank was a man who acted on what Helen decided, and Helen was the one who needed convincing. She sat at the bar and listened while Greta laid it out. The community supper, 2 days before the debt deadline. Free to anyone who came. Not a fundraiser, not a sales pitch, just food and people and the largest table Quartz Ridge had ever sat down to. Helen was quiet through all of it. She drank her coffee. She turned the cup in her hands. When Greta finished, Helen said, "Where does the food come from?" "I'll buy what I can. The rest I'm hoping people will contribute." "Hoping," Helen said. "Yes. And if they don't, then we feed fewer people. But I don't think that's what happens." Greta looked at her steadily. "You know this town better than I do. You know what it's been missing. I've been here 8 weeks, and even I can see it. People here are tired of being separate from each other. Kane has spent 4 years making sure of that, keeping people divided, making the men feel like solidarity is weakness. One big meal won't undo 4 years, but it might remind people what it felt like before." Helen set her cup down. "Victor Kane is going to hear about this the minute the first person talks." "I know. And he'll find a way to interfere." "Probably." Helen looked at her with that measuring expression she'd worn the first morning she walked in. "You're not scared of him." "I'm scared of losing the building," Greta said honestly. "I'm not scared of him personally. There's a difference." Something shifted in Helen's face, a decision being made somewhere behind the eyes. She picked up her cup, finished the coffee, and set it back down with the finality of a woman who'd made up her mind. "I'll bring flour," she said. "Frank's been holding 2 50-pound sacks he bought from the last grain shipment before Kane raised his warehouse prices. We've been stretching it. You can have one." Greta felt something loosen in her chest. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. I'll talk to Margaret Whitfield and the Cassidy women. Between us, we can probably cover the vegetables and some of the salt pork." Helen stood and pulled on her gloves. "How many people are you trying to feed?" "Everyone who comes." Helen raised an eyebrow. "That could be a lot of people." "I know," Greta said. "I'm counting on it." The next 3 weeks moved in 2 separate rhythms that ran alongside each other like 2 different rivers sharing a bank. One was the daily business of the saloon, the mornings and evenings and accounts, and the slow accumulation of money that was still falling short. The other was the quiet, careful work of building something that had no precedent in Quartz Ridge. Greta talked to people the way she'd always talked to people. Directly, without ceremony, assuming they were capable of making their own decisions. She talked to Carla Ostrowski, who said she'd bring whatever preserves she had and would talk to the women in the boarding house. She talked to the blacksmith's wife, a large, serious woman named Ruth Gideon, who said her husband would build the extra trestle tables if someone provided the lumber. She talked to the foreman of the rail crew, a man named Vasquez, who was from New Mexico originally and who listened to the whole plan in silence and then said, "My men eat better when they eat together. We'll bring whatever we've got in the camp stores." She did not announce it publicly. She did not put up a notice. She moved from person to person the way you built something piece by piece, carefully, making sure each piece was solid before you added the next. Jonas watched this happen around him with a complicated expression she couldn't always read. He helped when she asked him to and stayed out of the way when she didn't, which was the right instinct. But there were evenings when she came in from a conversation with someone to find him at the bar with a drink in front of him and a look on his face that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite despair but lived somewhere uncomfortable between the two. One night she came in late from the Whitfield ranch, where she'd spent 2 hours with Margaret Whitfield and 2 of the neighboring farm wives going over what each of them could contribute, and Jonas was sitting at the bar with Dale, who was nursing a beer he'd been nursing for an hour. "You rode out to the Whitfield place?" Jonas asked. "Margaret couldn't come into town. She's got a sick cow." "You rode out alone, at night." The moon was up. He looked at her with an expression that was exasperation and something else underneath it. "Greta, Kane's men have been—" "I know what Kane's men have been doing," she said, hanging up her coat. "I also know that sitting inside waiting for something to happen doesn't accomplish anything." Dale took a careful sip of his beer and looked at the wall. "I'm not asking you to sit inside," Jonas said. "I'm asking you not to ride alone at night on a road where Kane has people watching." She turned around and looked at him. He was genuinely worried, not performing it for effect. She understood the difference. "All right," she said. "Next time I'll ask Dale to come." Dale looked mildly alarmed. "I don't ride." "Then I'll ask Eli." "Eli is 11, Jonas said. 11 and a half, Eli said from the kitchen doorway, where he'd been listening to all of this while pretending to scrub a pot. Jonas looked at him, looked at Greta. Something moved through his face, a kind of complicated warmth that he tried to keep off his expression and didn't entirely succeed. "Fine," he said. But tell me when you're going." "Agreed," she said. It wasn't a fight, but it was the closest thing to one they'd had, and afterward, in the small hours when the saloon was locked and quiet, she thought about it not as a conflict but as evidence of something, that Jonas had started to care about the outcome of this in a way that was personal. Not just the money, not just the building, the thing itself. That mattered. With 10 days to the deadline, Kane made his move. It came in the form of a letter delivered to Jonas's hand by a man in a clean coat who arrived at 9 in the morning, waited while Jonas read it, and then left without saying a word. Jonas came to the kitchen with the letter open in his hand. Greta was in the middle of the second bread batch, but she looked up when she saw his face. "What is it?" He put the letter on the flour-dusted counter. She read it without touching it, leaning over it the way you read something you didn't want to pick up. It was from Kane's lawyer. Formally worded, dense with legal language she had to work through. The substance of it was this. Kane had become aware of plans for a public gathering at Mercer's Saloon within the next 2 weeks. He wished to remind Jonas Mercer that under the terms of the existing loan agreement, any commercial event held on the property required advance written notice to the lender. Failure to provide such notice could be construed as a breach of contract, entitling the lender to accelerate the debt collection timeline. Greta straightened up. "Can he do that?" she asked. "I don't know." Jonas's voice was flat. "Probably not, but by the time I find out for certain, the deadline will have passed." "Do you have a copy of the original loan agreement?" "In the office." They spent an hour going through the papers in Jonas's office, which was a small room behind the bar that she'd never been in before. A desk buried under 8 years of accumulated paperwork, receipts, and invoices, and letters filed in no particular order in a wooden crate that had been pushed under the desk. The loan agreement was at the bottom of the crate, wrinkled and coffee-stained at one corner. She read through it carefully. Her English was good, better than most people expected, given the accent she still carried. But legal language was its own kind of English, and she took her time. "Here," she said, finding the relevant clause. She read it aloud. "Any commercial event defined as an event for which admission is charged or which is primarily organized for the purpose of generating revenue." She looked up. "If we're not charging admission and the supper isn't primarily for revenue, if it's a community meal free to everyone, it doesn't meet the definition." Jonas read it himself, twice. Kane's lawyer might argue it differently. Kane's lawyer can argue whatever he wants. The contract says what it says. She set the paper down. "We send a written notice anyway. Today. We describe it exactly as what it is, but a free community meal, no admission charged, not a commercial event. We put it in writing and we send it before the end of business today." "That's..." Jonas stopped. "You've done this kind of thing before." "I've dealt with people who use paperwork to scare other people before," she said. "It's a different thing." He looked at her over the desk, through the small window of afternoon light that came through the room's single high window. He looked at her the way people sometimes looked at her when she did something that surprised them, with a reassessment happening visibly behind the eyes. "I'll write the letter," he said. "Good," she said. "And Jonas, don't be polite about it. Be precise." He almost smiled. "I know how to write a letter." "I know you do. I've read your letters. They're very polite." He wrote the letter. It was precise. The letter went out that afternoon. There was no response from Kane, which was either good or meant he was preparing something else. She didn't have time to worry about it. 8 days out, the preparations had taken on a momentum of their own that was both encouraging and slightly terrifying, the way large things sometimes had momentum that exceeded your ability to control them. Helen Brody had mobilized the ranch women more effectively than Greta had dared hope. By midweek, she had commitments from 11 families: flour, preserved vegetables, smoked meats, potatoes by the sack, dried beans, butter, eggs. Ruth Gideon's husband had built 3 trestle tables, longer than any table Greta had seen outside of a church hall, and they were being stored behind the livery stable until the night of the supper. Vasquez from the rail crew came in Wednesday morning with 2 of his men and said they'd bring the camp's cooking equipment, 2 large iron kettles that could hold enough soup to feed 40 men each, a portable fire grate. They set it up in the back lot to make sure it fit, then broke it down again and promised to have it back the night before. Carla Ostrowski organized the women from the boarding house into a preparation crew that would come in the afternoon of the supper to help Greta with the bread. There were 7 of them, women of various ages and origins who'd been living in the same building for years without having a project in common. Carla said they'd been talking about it all week, planning who would bring what, arguing mildly about whose recipe for cornbread was better. It was growing, not in the way that things grew when you forced them, but in the way they grew when they were real, drawing people toward them because the thing itself had gravity. And then, 6 days out, Jonas came to find her with the news about the evening crowds. It was bad. 3 nights in a row. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. The bar had been nearly empty after 8 o'clock. The family evening on Tuesday brought $12, the best Tuesday yet, but the regular drinking crowd had collapsed, and the combined take for 3 evenings was less than $30. She sat with the numbers and didn't speak for a while. Kane's billiards room, Jonas said. It wasn't a question. How do you know? Creed came in Wednesday afternoon, but not to drink, just to tell me. He said Kane's been buying rounds. Free whiskey from 7 to 8 every evening this week. He's doing it deliberately. Free whiskey. Subsidizing his own bar to drain hers for the week before the deadline. The math of it was ugly. Kane could absorb the cost indefinitely, and Jonas couldn't match it, and both of them knew it. He's not trying to win the evenings, Greta said slowly. He's trying to run out our last week of income before the deadline. Yes, she did the calculation. With 3 empty evenings and 3 days to go until the supper, they were going to fall short by more than she'd projected. Even if the supper went exactly as she hoped, even if people came and brought food and the whole thing was everything she'd built it up to be, the money question wasn't solved by a free meal. The money question was $1,200 by a specific date, and they didn't have it, and nothing about the supper changed that arithmetic. She sat with this for a long time. Jonas sat across from her and didn't try to fill the silence, which she was grateful for. Finally, she said, "What does the supper need to be?" He looked at her carefully. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've been thinking about this as a community event, a way to show people what this place is, build goodwill, push back against Kane's narrative." She paused. "But the money problem is still the money problem." "Yes, so either we solve it separately, or—" She stopped. He waited. Something was assembling itself in her mind. She could feel it the way you felt a structure taking shape, not planned exactly, more like recognized. She'd been thinking about the supper as a gesture, as a statement, as a way of fighting Kane on different ground, but maybe that was still thinking too small. Maybe the supper wasn't a gesture at all. "What if the supper is where the answer lives?" she said. "You're not making sense." "I know, I'm still thinking." She drummed her fingers on the bar, once. Kane's power in this town comes from people being separate from each other. He keeps people divided, the workers from the families from the merchants, everyone from everyone else. Because divided people can't organize, can't push back, can't decide together what they want. That's true. So the supper puts them all in the same room. She looked at Jonas. Everyone. The rail workers, the ranch families, the merchants, the miners from the Western claims. Everyone who's been living in the same town for years without a single thing that belongs to all of them. And when they're all in the same room, they'll see what Kane is trying to take from them, not just your saloon, the one place that's been trying to be something for all of them. Jonas was quiet. "I'm not going to plan what happens next," she said. "I can't plan that. But I'm going to make the supper as real as I can make it, and I'm going to trust that people who can see something clearly will make a decision about it." "That's a lot of trust," he said. "I know." She met his eyes. "Do you trust them?" He thought about it honestly. She could always tell when he was being honest because the answer took longer. "Some of them," he said. "Helen Brody, Vasquez, Old Pete, Carla." He paused. "Ruth Gideon's husband, the school teacher." He paused again. "More than I thought I did." "Then that's enough to start." The 2 days before the supper were the hardest physical work of her life, and she'd grown up on a farm. The bread alone was staggering. She'd committed to enough for the entire town, which meant 200 people if the worst happened, and everyone showed up, which she was now simultaneously hoping for and quietly dreading from a logistics standpoint. She started 4 days out, baking in every available window of time, building a stockpile wrapped in cloth and stored in the cool of the storage room. Eli was there every morning at 4:30 without fail, stoking the fire, watching the dough, carrying, washing, stacking. He didn't talk much during those early mornings, but his presence was steady in a way that had stopped feeling like a child helping and started feeling like a genuine partner. "You know what this supper is for?" she asked him on the second morning, the bread going in for its 6th batch in 2 days. "To feed people," he said. "Yes." "And?" He thought about it. "So they remember what it's like when someone does that." She looked at him. He was watching the oven with his arms folded, the way he'd started doing, mimicking, probably, something he'd seen her do, but also genuinely attending. "Exactly," she said. He nodded, satisfied. Carla Ostrowski arrived with her boarding house crew on the afternoon of the day before the supper. 7 women with flour-dusted aprons and strong opinions about cornbread who filled the kitchen with noise and the particular productive chaos of people who knew what they were doing and were doing it together. Greta directed them with clear instructions and got out of their way when the instructions had been understood, which was the only way to work with capable people. Vasquez's men set up the kettles in the back lot and had a fire going by mid-afternoon, the soup bones and beans already in, and the smell rolling out into the street by evening. Jonah spent the day moving tables, organizing the room, doing the physical work of preparation with a focused efficiency she hadn't seen in him before. He was good at it, stronger than he looked, and methodical, the kind of man who measured twice before he moved anything. By evening, the saloon's main room had been transformed. The tables rearranged into long rows, 3 of Gideon's trestle tables added alongside, candles set out, the bar cleared to serve as a food station. At 9 that night, when the work had reached a stopping point, everyone left, and it was just Jonas and Greta and the 2 remaining hours of the night. She sat on the bar and looked at the room. It looked right. Not beautiful exactly. It was still a frontier saloon with rough walls and sawdust floors, and the permanent smell of old beer soaked into the wood. But there were 60 places set at tables, and more would be added in the morning, and the room had a feeling she'd felt before in places where something real was about to happen. Jonas came and stood next to her, looking at it too. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "I want to say something." She waited. "Whatever happens," he said, "whatever Kane does, whatever the money does or doesn't work out to." He stopped, gathered himself. "You came here and you didn't give up on something I'd already given up on. I don't know what that's worth, but I know it's worth something." She looked at him. He was looking at the room, not at her. The set of tables, the candles not yet lit, the space that would be full tomorrow and might change everything or might not. "Jonas," she said. He looked at her. "After tomorrow," she said, "we'll have time to say everything that needs saying." She held his gaze. "Let's get through it first." He nodded, not disappointed, something closer to settled. She reached behind the bar and found the bottle of whiskey she'd been saving for something she couldn't name yet, poured 2 small glasses. They sat on bar stools in the empty, set-table room and drank without speaking. Outside, the night was enormous and the town was quiet, and the deadline was 36 hours away. She thought about all the people who had said yes. Helen with her flour, Vasquez with his kettles, Carla with her crew, Ruth Gideon's husband with his tables, Eli at 4:30 every morning, all of them choosing this. Choosing to say that this building and the woman who'd walked into it 8 weeks ago with $42 and no certain welcome were worth the effort of showing up. She hadn't let herself feel that until right now. She felt it now. Set it down again, carefully. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow. Then she poured the whiskey down, set the glass on the bar, and went to check on the bread. The morning of the supper, Greta burned the first batch of bread. Not badly. Not ruined, just darker than she wanted along the bottom crust. The kind of thing that happened when you'd been awake since 3 and your attention drifted for 6 minutes. She caught it, pulled it, set the loaves aside. They were fine. Edible. But she stood there looking at them for a moment with a feeling that had nothing to do with bread. The particular unsteadiness of a person who has built something large and is standing at the edge of the day when it either holds or doesn't. Eli was at the stove behind her. He looked at the loaves. He looked at her. "Still good," he said. "I know. My face wouldn't know the difference." She turned around and looked at him. This boy in his mismatched boots, flour on his forearm, trying to be useful in the way he always tried to be useful. Something moved through her chest that she'd been keeping managed for weeks. "Load the second batch," she said, "and don't let it go past 40 minutes. "I know," he said. I've done it before. I know you have. She went out front to check the room. The trestle tables were in place, the candles set, the bread baskets stacked behind the bar. Vasquez's men had the kettles going in the back lot since 6, the smell already strong enough to reach the street. Thick bean and salt pork broth that had been developing overnight, the kind of smell that didn't ask permission, just moved through a town and told people something was happening. Jonas was at the door when she came through, looking at the street. The morning was clear, the kind of hard, bright October morning the territory did well, where the light came at a low angle and made everything look sharper than it was. "Anyone yet?" she asked. Carla walked by 20 minutes ago with 2 women from the boarding house. "They're going around back to help with the kettles." He paused. "Frank Brody's wagon came in 20 minutes ago with Helen and the children. She's setting up the vegetable station." Greta exhaled slowly. "You nervous?" Jonas asked, not looking at her. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. "Me too." By noon, something was happening that she hadn't entirely let herself believe in until she saw it. People came, not in a rush, not all at once. They came the way people in small towns came to things, cautiously at first, testing the edges of it. A family here and 3 workers there. An old man alone, 2 miners she'd never seen before who must have come down from the western claims. They came in through the front door and stopped just inside, taking in the room, the tables, the smell, and then they moved to find a seat with the slightly dazed look of people who hadn't expected to feel what they were feeling. Dale worked the food line with a seriousness that was, for him, practically festive. He ladled soup without speaking, pointed people to the bread, refilled the baskets when they emptied. He'd been skeptical of all of this from the beginning. She'd known it, and hadn't fought it, just let the work speak. And watching him today, the efficiency and care he brought to it, she understood that his skepticism had never been about the idea. It had been about whether he was allowed to hope it would work. Carla Ostrowski moved through the room with a coffee pot in each hand, and the brisk competence of a woman who'd run a boarding house for 15 years and had long since stopped being intimidated by crowds. She knew half the people by name, which helped. A stranger handing you coffee is service, someone who knows your name handing you coffee is something else. Eli carried bread baskets and cleared plates with the focused intensity he brought to everything. He didn't play or joke, he worked genuinely, the way a person worked when the work meant something to them. A woman at the far table said something to him, and Greta couldn't hear the words, but she saw Eli's face, a small, genuine smile, surprised out of him. And then he went back to work. She moved between the kitchen and the room, checking, adjusting, noticing. What she noticed was this: people were talking to each other, not the careful transactional talk of people who shared a town but lived separate lives. Real conversation. The Brody children playing with the Vasquez foreman's daughter under one of the trestle tables, the seamstress from the boarding house comparing something with one of the ranch wives, 2 rail workers she recognized sitting across from a merchant she'd seen in the dry goods store, all 3 of them leaning in over their soup bowls with the body language of men who'd found something to agree about. It was loud. That was the thing she hadn't expected, how loud it got. Not the noise of a saloon, not the particular dull roar of drinking, but the noise of people who were genuinely in a good mood, the kind of noise that climbed without anyone trying to make it climb. At one point she went to the kitchen for more bread, and Eli followed her in and said simply, "There's a lot of people." "Yes," she said. "More than I thought." "More than I thought, too." He picked up a basket and then hesitated. "Is it working?" She looked at him. "What does it look like to you?" He thought about it seriously, which she'd come to expect from him. "It looks like the kind of thing people remember," he said. She took the bread basket from him. "Then it's working," she said. "Go, Chutson." Victor Kane arrived at 2 in the afternoon. She saw him from across the room. The good suit, the measured walk, the way he paused at the door long enough to take inventory. He had no one with him, which surprised her. He came alone, looked around the room the way he'd looked around the saloon that first morning 8 weeks ago, and then he found a space at the near end of one of the trestle tables, and he sat down. Jonas saw him at the same moment she did. She felt Jonas go still beside her. "Don't," she said quietly. "I'm not doing anything." "Good." She watched Kane pick up a bread roll from the basket on the table. He looked at it for a moment, then ate it. He looked at the room. All the people, the noise, the fullness of it. His face told her nothing. He had the face of a man who'd spent decades not letting his face say things he didn't want said. But she watched him watch the room, and she thought, he came alone. A man who came to intimidate brought company. A man who came to make an offer brought a lawyer. A man who came alone, in the middle of a community supper he hadn't been able to stop and hadn't been invited to, came because he needed to see it for himself. That told her something. Carla appeared at Kane's elbow with a coffee cup, which she set in front of him without comment. Kane looked up at her. Carla looked at him with a steady, mild expression that said she'd seen harder men than him and found them equally manageable. She moved on. Kane wrapped his hands around the coffee cup and kept watching the room. I'm out. At 3 o'clock, when the first wave of people had eaten and more were still coming in from the street, Jonas pulled Greta aside into the kitchen. He had a look on his face she hadn't seen before. Not the uncertain worry of the past weeks, something sharper and less comfortable than that. Creed just told me something, Jonas said. She waited. Kane filed papers this morning with the county land office. He said it carefully, like a man trying to keep his voice level when what he wanted to do was something else. He's pre-filed a transfer of property claim. His lawyer says the debt agreement gives him the right to begin the process before the deadline if he has cause to believe the debt won't be met. The room was loud around them. Through the kitchen doorway she could hear the voices, the laughter, the clink of cups. Is that legal? She asked. I don't know. Creed said the land office clerk told him it was irregular. Irregular meaning probably not legal or irregular meaning unusual? Creed said he seemed uncomfortable. She stood with this for a moment. It was a familiar move, the thing she'd seen in the letter about the commercial event clause, the same pattern. Kane using paperwork not to win a legal argument but to create uncertainty, to make Jonas feel the ground shifting under him, to force a reaction that might produce an exploitable mistake. When does it become actionable? She said. Tomorrow morning. If we don't have the money by 9, his lawyer can present the filing to the circuit judge. Tomorrow morning. Not tomorrow evening, not the end of the business day. 9 in the morning. What time do we have to have the money to Kane directly to satisfy the debt agreement? The agreement says close of business on the deadline day. And close of business is 6 in the evening. She looked at him. Then the land office filing is an intimidation tactic. If we satisfy the debt by 6 tomorrow evening, the filing is void. If we satisfy the debt, they looked at each other. The noise from the main room pressed through the doorway between them. She was thinking about the money, about what was in the till, about the shortfall she'd calculated and recalculated until the numbers were permanent fixtures in her mind. Even a perfect evening, even the best possible outcome from the supper, they were still short. Goodwill didn't pay Kane's lawyer. She had been honest with herself about this from the beginning. The supper was not a fundraiser, but somewhere in the back of her mind, the part that ran quiet calculations while the rest of her was focused on bread dough and logistics, she'd been carrying a different possibility. One she hadn't said aloud because saying it made it a plan, and plans could fail. She said it now. After the supper, she said, I want to make a statement to everyone in the room. Jonas looked at her carefully. What kind of statement? I want to tell them the truth, she said. What Kane is trying to do, what the building means, what the deadline is. She held his gaze. And then I want to put the whiskey key on the bar and ask them what kind of town they want Quartz Ridge to be. The silence between them was the length of a long breath. Greta, he said, I know. You're asking them to give money. I'm not asking them to give anything. I'm asking them to decide. She paused. There's a difference, Jonas. You know there is. He ran his hand over the back of his neck, the way he did when he was working something out that didn't want to be worked out easily. If they don't, we lose the building and Kane wins, and I was wrong about this town. She said it evenly. I don't think I'm wrong, but I could be. He looked at her for a long time. All right, he said. All right? All right. He put his hand on the kitchen door frame, steadying himself or just touching something solid. She couldn't tell which. You talk. I'll stand next to you. By 5 in the afternoon, the supper had been going for 5 hours, and the room was as full as it had been at any point in the day. The later wave of people, the ones who'd heard from the ones who came early, filling the places left by the first crowd. The kettles outside had been refilled twice. The bread was running low, but not out. Greta had been on her feet for 14 hours, and her back ached in a specific, informative way that told her the next 12 hours were going to be expensive. Kane was still there. She'd watched him from the kitchen doorway. Periodically, he'd eaten, drank his coffee, been refilled by Carla twice without acknowledgement, and sat for 3 hours in the middle of the community he'd spent 4 years trying to keep divided, watching it be undivided in front of him. His face was still neutral, but he'd stopped looking at the room with that inventory assessment. Now he just looked. She didn't know what that meant and didn't have time to figure it out. At 5:30, she caught Jonas's eye across the room. He nodded. She moved to the center of the floor. She didn't climb on a table or a chair. She just stood in the space between the rows of tables where the most people could see her, and she waited a moment, and the room gradually understood that something was happening and quieted down the way rooms did. Not all at once, corner by corner, until it was mostly still. She looked at the faces. 60, 70 people still in the room. She recognized most of them now. The weeks had given her that. The accumulation of morning conversations and family evenings and all the small daily encounters that turned strangers into neighbors. "I'm not going to make a long speech," she said. Her accent was out there, clearly audible in the quiet room, the Bavarian lilt she'd never lost. She'd stopped trying to hide it weeks ago. "I'm not good at long speeches." A small laugh from somewhere near the back. "You all know what this place is," she said. "Some of you have been coming since I arrived. Some of you came today for the first time. Either way, you've seen what we've been trying to build here." She paused. "I want to tell you something that you may already know or may have heard pieces of. Victor Kane holds a debt against this building. The deadline to pay that debt is tomorrow. If we don't have the full amount by 6 tomorrow evening, he takes the property." The room was very quiet. She didn't look at Kane. She focused on the faces she knew. Helen Brody at the far table, Frank's large hand resting near hers. Vasquez, arms folded, watching from near the wall. Carla, coffee pot still in hand, still as a post. Old Pete with Eli standing beside him, the boy serious and attentive. "I'm not going to tell you what to do with that information," she said. "You're grown people. You understand what a deadline is." She reached into her apron pocket and took out the key. The saloon's whiskey cabinet key, the thing that unlocked the good stock Jonas kept behind the bar. She held it up so the room could see it. Then she walked to the bar and set it down on the counter, on top of the empty bread basket. "The whiskey is locked," she said. "The food is here. The choice is yours." She looked at the room. "Whatever you decide. Thank you for coming today. This is the best day this building has ever had. I know that, and Jonas knows it, and that's true whether or not anything else happens." She stepped back. The silence held. It was the longest silence she'd experienced since arriving in Quartz Ridge. Maybe since arriving in America. It had weight in it. Not the weight of indifference, but the weight of people feeling something they hadn't expected to feel and taking a moment to understand it. Then Frank Brody stood up. He was a large man, and when he stood, the room noticed. He reached into his coat and put money on the table in front of him. A deliberate movement, no performance to it, just a man placing something down, and said, in his careful, measured voice, "I've been eating this woman's bread for 2 months. This town needs this building. I'm in." He sat back down. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Vasquez pushed off the wall and reached into his jacket and said, "Rail crew's in," and walked to the bar and set a folded amount of bills next to the key. Then 3 things happened at once. Carla set the coffee pot on the nearest table and went to her coat. 2 of the boarding house women moved at the same time, and one of the miners Greta had never met stood up and said loudly to the man next to him, "You got anything?" And the man next to him said, "Some." And they both stood up. The room shifted. Not dramatically, not with noise or ceremony. It moved the way a crowd moved when it had made a decision. Individuals becoming something collective, the small private calculations giving way to a shared direction. People reached for coats and pockets and purses. Some amounts were large, some were clearly whatever was available, and none of it was announced. She stood at the edge of the room and watched it happen. Jonas was next to her. She became aware of his hand, not holding hers, just close, his knuckles brushing the back of her hand, the kind of contact that wasn't a declaration, but wasn't nothing either. She didn't move away. She was watching the bar, where the money was accumulating next to the key. She was watching Kane. He was still at his place at the trestle table. He was watching the room the way she was watching it, and his face had finally given something up. Not defeat exactly, but the expression of a man recalculating something and finding that the numbers weren't what he'd built his plans around. He looked, for the first time since she'd met him, like a man who was surprised. She'd thought about this moment, in the weeks of preparation, the late nights, the quiet hours. She'd thought about what it would feel like to watch Kane realize that this town wasn't what he'd arranged it to be. She'd thought it might feel like victory. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like something quieter and more complicated. Like a truth landing, like the moment in an argument when both people finally understand what the argument was actually about. He caught her looking at him. She held it. He was the one who looked away. Ruth Gideon's husband came in from the street at 6:30. He'd gone to fetch something from the hardware store and come back in through the front door with the particular expression of a man who'd made a decision on the walk. He was a large, quiet man, the kind of man who didn't explain himself, just acted. He went to the bar and put down a substantial fold of bills and said to Dale, "That's from the Merchant Guild account. Alton at the assay office has the same." He didn't wait for a response. Dale looked at the money. He looked at the room. He looked at Greta. He had been impassive through most of the day, efficient and steady and unrevealing, the way Dale was always unrevealing. But she saw something move through his face now, behind the skepticism that had been his permanent weather. Not sentimentality. Something harder than that. Something that looked like being right about a person you'd been afraid to trust. "You need help counting it?" he asked her. "Yes," she said. "In a while." She turned back to the room. It was still going. That was the thing. It hadn't peaked and subsided. It just kept going. One person after another, the quiet, steady movement of a community deciding to be a community. And she stood in the middle of it and let herself feel it without managing it, without calculating it, without turning it into the next problem to solve. Just for a moment. Then Eli appeared at her elbow with an empty breadbasket in his hands and said, practically, "We're out of the cornbread. Should I get more from the back?" She looked at him. His face was flushed from the kitchen heat, and there was a smear of something on his chin, and he was watching her with those steady, serious eyes that never missed anything. "Yes," she said. "Get the rest of it." He went. She looked at the bar, at the key sitting in the middle of all of it, and at the money piled around it, and she thought, tomorrow is still tomorrow. We still have to count it. It still might not be enough. Kane still has his lawyer and his land office filing and the 1,000 small instruments of a powerful man who doesn't lose gracefully. But the room was full of people who had chosen this. That was real. Whatever came next, that was real. They counted the money at midnight. The last guest had gone an hour earlier. The room emptying gradually. The way good evenings ended, people leaving in 2s and 3s reluctant, the conversations trailing out onto the street and continuing there until the cold finally moved them on. Vasquez's men broke down the kettles in the back lot. Helen and Frank Brody stayed until nearly 11. Helen helping clear the last of the bread baskets, Frank stacking chairs without being asked, their children asleep on a bench against the far wall wrapped in a horse blanket someone had produced from nowhere. When they finally left, Frank stopped at the door and looked back at Jonas and said, "Whatever the number is tomorrow, you've got people behind you now. That's not nothing." Jonas said, "I know, thank you, Frank." Frank nodded once and went out. Then it was just Greta and Jonas and Dale and Eli, who had refused to go home to the relay station and was now sitting on the floor behind the bar with his back against the cabinet, asleep with his arms folded across his chest and his mismatched boots sticking out in front of him. Dale brought the money to the bar. It was in a biscuit tin. He'd been collecting it throughout the evening, methodical as always, keeping it in one place. Nobody asked him to. He just did it because it was sensible. And sensible things were Dale's natural territory. They counted it together. Jonas stacked the bills, and Greta counted coins, and Dale kept the running tally in the accounts ledger, writing each denomination in his cramped, careful hand. It took 40 minutes. When they finished, the three of them stood looking at the number Dale had written at the bottom of the column. $1,214. Greta set down the last coin stack. She put both hands flat on the bar top and looked at the number and did not say anything for a long time. "That's over," Jonas said. His voice had a quality she'd never heard in it before. Not quite disbelief, not quite relief, something that lived between the two and hadn't found its name yet. $14 over, Dale said. He looked at the number. He looked at them. He picked up his pencil and put a small, neat line under the total, the way accountants underlined final figures, and set the pencil down. "That'll do." Coming from Dale, that was practically a celebration speech. Jonas laughed. It came out of him suddenly, the real laugh. Not the surprised half-laugh she'd glimpsed in those early weeks. The full version, unprepared. A man who'd been holding something tight for so long that when it released he didn't know what to do with his face. He laughed, and then covered it with his hand, and then gave up covering it. Greta looked at the tin of money. She looked at the number. She thought about 11 weeks ago. Standing outside this building in the October dust with 2 bags and a hat box and a cattle buyer watching her from the stage window. The town spelling itself out in front of her in all its run-down, unwelcoming plainness, and the calculation she'd made even then, standing in the street. This is what there is. What can be done with it? She'd spent a lifetime making that calculation. In Bavaria, in the crossing, in every room she'd stood in as a woman who didn't fit the available categories. You looked at what there was and you asked what could be done with it, and then you did it. And you didn't look for permission because permission was rarely offered to people who looked like her, or came from where she came from, or carried the particular combination of audacity and practicality that had always made other people slightly uncomfortable. She wasn't crying. She wasn't the kind of person who cried at things she'd worked for. The work itself had used up whatever that emotion was before it could become tears. But she felt something move through her that was large and quiet, and had a long tail on it, reaching back to every difficult thing that had brought her to this bar stool in this frontier town counting money in a biscuit tin at midnight. "All right," she said. Her voice was steady. "Tomorrow morning we take it to Kane directly. Not his lawyer. Him." Ansaman. She was at Kane's freight office at 8 o'clock. She had not slept more than 2 hours. She'd been awake at 4 out of habit, the oven already calling her toward the kitchen, but she'd let it go cold this once, just this one morning, and sat in the pre-dawn quiet of the saloon with coffee and the biscuit tin in front of her, and let the silence be what it was. Jonas had offered to come. She'd told him no. "This is between me and Kane," she'd said. "Greta, I know you want to be there, but he'll perform differently with you in the room. With me alone, he has to be direct." She looked at him. "Let me do this." He'd looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd come to know, the one where he was deciding whether to push back or trust her. He chose trust. She was aware that this had become easier for him in recent weeks, and she was aware of what that meant without saying it. Kane's freight office was a solid building on the north end of the block, well-maintained, the kind of building that announced its owner's prosperity without shouting about it. His clerk, a young man with a carefully neutral expression, told her Mr. Kane was not available for unscheduled. "Tell him Greta Falcon is here with a biscuit tin," she said. The clerk looked at the tin. He went through the inner door. Kane appeared 30 seconds later. He was in his shirt sleeves, which meant she'd caught him before he'd fully assembled himself for the day. And there was something faintly satisfying about that. The good suit not yet on, the man himself rather than the presentation of the man. He looked at her. He looked at the tin. "Come in," he said. She sat across from him at his desk, a large desk, a serious desk, the desk of a man who wanted you to understand the weight of his decisions. And she set the tin on the surface between them and opened it. She didn't say anything. She let him look at it. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked at her. "Count it," she said. "I want a receipt." He picked up a stack of bills. He was a careful man, methodical in the way of someone who'd handled money long enough to have opinions about it, and he counted without rushing. She watched him count. She kept her hands in her lap and her back straight, and her face as neutral as she could make it, which was fairly neutral because she'd had years of practice. When he finished, he set the money down. $1,214, he said. "Correct." He looked at her steadily. She looked back. "You were 14 short when the week started," he said. "I know what we were." He was quiet for a moment. A long moment. She watched his face do the things she'd watched it do during the supper, the recalculating, the adjustment of something internal that didn't show itself directly, but changed the quality of his expression. "The land office filing," he said, "should be withdrawn this morning," she said, "which we both know it wasn't a legitimate claim." He considered that. "My lawyer would disagree." "Your lawyer would say whatever you pay him to say." She kept her voice even. "I'm not interested in what your lawyer disagrees with. I'm interested in a receipt for $1,214 and the withdrawal of a filing that was designed to intimidate, not to prevail legally. We both know the difference." The silence stretched. Kane leaned back in his chair. He was looking at her with an expression that she found difficult to read. Not hostile exactly, not the cold assessment of their first meeting, something more complicated than that. Like a man trying to decide something about a person that he hadn't expected to still be deciding this late in the game. "You know," he said slowly, "I've been in this territory for 12 years. I've dealt with a lot of people who thought they were going to change something." He paused. "Most of them were wrong." "I know," she said. "And I'm not trying to change the territory. I just wanted to keep a building." "A building," he said. "And what was in it?" she said. He was quiet for another moment. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out a receipt book and wrote out the receipt in a clean, businesslike hand. Amount received, date, debt satisfied in full, signature, and tore it off and slid it across the desk to her. She picked it up. "The land office filing will be withdrawn by noon," he said. It wasn't gracious. It wasn't an apology. It was a statement of fact delivered by a man who had lost a specific contest and was intelligent enough to recognize it without requiring a scene about it. She stood. She picked up the empty tin. "Mr. Kane," she said. He looked up at her. "You could have what we have," she said. "Not in that building. I know you want that land for your hotel. But what we built there, the thing that filled that room last night, that's not magic. It's just people treated like they're worth something." She paused. "A man with your resources could do that at 10 times the scale." He looked at her for a long time. She couldn't tell what he was thinking. Probably she never would be able to tell what Victor Kane was thinking. But something in his expression had shifted from the careful blankness of a man guarding his position to something slower and less defended. "That's an interesting thing to say to the man you just came to pay off," he said. "I say interesting things," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth that was almost barely the ghost of a smile. "Get out of my office, Miss Falcon." "Good morning, Mr. Kane," she said, and she left. She walked back to the saloon in the October morning light with the receipt in her coat pocket and the empty biscuit tin under her arm, and she felt the particular quality of a completed thing, not triumphant, not relieved, just finished, the way a loaf of bread felt when it was done and right and you set it on the counter to cool. Jonas was waiting outside the saloon door. He'd been pacing, she could tell, the particular stillness of a man who'd just stopped pacing when he saw her coming. She walked up and held out the receipt. He took it. He read it. He looked up at her. "It's done," he said. "It's done." He looked down at the receipt again, then back at her, and she watched the weight of it hit him. Not in the moment she'd said the words, but a second later, the way real things landed slightly delayed, the body needing a beat to catch up with what the mind already knew. His face did several things in quick succession and then settled into something she hadn't seen in it before. Not the almost smile she'd been watching for weeks, but the real version, unguarded, reaching his eyes and staying there. "Come inside," she said. "I need to start the bread." He laughed again, the real laugh, the one that was still new enough to surprise both of them, and held the door open, and she walked through into the smell of yesterday's supper still faint in the wood, the morning cold, the saloon quiet, and waiting. Eli was already at the stove. Of course he was. He had the fire going and the first dough batch set out on the counter, the flour measured with the imprecision of a child doing it by memory rather than weight, a bit heavy on the left side of the bowl. She looked at it and didn't correct it because it would be fine, and because the fact that he'd done it at all, that he'd come in at 4:30 on the morning after the biggest night this building had ever had, and started the work without being asked, was the kind of thing that didn't need correcting. "You should have slept," she said. "I slept enough," he said, which probably wasn't true. She looked at him, his serious face, his mismatched boots, the flour on his hands. She thought about what he'd said 2 days ago. It looks like the kind of thing people remember. She set the empty biscuit tin on the shelf above the stove where it would stay. "Eli," she said. He looked up. "After the morning rush, I want to talk to you about something." "About what?" "About whether you want to stay here," she said. "Properly. Not sleeping at the relay station. Here." He went still in the way he went still when something important was happening that he hadn't let himself anticipate. She'd seen it before, the careful stillness of a child who'd learned that wanting things too visibly was dangerous. "I'd have to ask old Pete," he said carefully. "Pete Harker came to the supper last night," she said. "We talked." He said he's been worried about you for a year and that anyone who'd take you in proper was doing him a favor. Eli looked at the dough. He looked at the stove. He was doing something with his face that she recognized as the work of keeping it neutral while something was happening underneath, something that had nowhere to go yet and needed a moment to find its direction. Jonas would have to agree, he said finally. His voice had a small crack in it that he covered quickly. Jonas suggested it first, she said. He looked at her. Check the dough, she said. It needs another 5 minutes. He turned back to the dough. His shoulders did something. A small release, a slight change in their set. The particular shift of a person putting something down that they'd been carrying for a long time without quite realizing how long. She started the coffee. Dale came in at 7, which was usual. He looked at the clean room, the set tables, the candles from last night replaced with fresh ones, the saloon restored to its morning self. He looked at Greta behind the bar. How'd it go with Kane? He said. No preamble, no other greeting. Receipt in my pocket, she said. He picked up the bar rag. He wiped the counter in his slow, thorough way. Good, he said. That was all. From Dale, that was everything. The morning rush came, as it had come every morning for 9 weeks now. The rail workers first, then the ranch hands, then the regular faces she knew by name and coffee preference, and the particular seat each one favored. They came in the room filled with noise and the smell of bread and coffee and soup, and Greta moved through it with Eli beside her and Dale at the bar. And Jonas came down the stairs at 8 and stood for a moment in the doorway between the back hallway and the main room, taking it in. She watched him watch it. The full tables, the voices, the bread baskets going out and coming back empty, the particular living quality of a room that was being used the way it was meant to be used. He caught her eye across the room. She tilted her head toward the kitchen. Bread's ready. And he nodded and moved toward the bar to help Dale, rolling up his sleeves as he went. And the morning continued. Set. There are things that a place can become if the people in it decide to let it. This is not a simple thing. It requires someone to see the possibility before it exists. To look at a failing saloon in a hard-luck frontier town and see not what it is, but what it could be if someone cared enough to push. That kind of seeing is a rare thing, and it doesn't come free. It costs something. It costs the comfort of the easy answer, the safety of small expectations, the protection of not trying. Greta Falcon had never been good at small expectations. She'd come from a village where the smart choice was always the same choice, the quiet choice, the stay-in-your-lane choice, and she'd made the mistake of not being built that way, of looking at what was in front of her and asking what could be done with it every time, regardless of who that made uncomfortable. It had cost her. It had cost her the familiar, the easy, the kind of life that fits inside the shape that other people have already cut for it. She had crossed an ocean and arrived in a dusty town with 2 bags and a plan nobody had endorsed, and the certainty, not confidence, not arrogance, just the settled knowledge of someone who has tested themselves enough times to know what they're made of, that she could make something work if she was allowed to try. She'd been allowed, barely, reluctantly, on the strength of almost nothing except Jonas's exhausted willingness to let someone else try. And she had tried, and it had worked, and now the building was theirs and the debt was paid, and the town had become, in a single evening, more itself than it had been in years. But here's what she understood. Standing in the kitchen on a November morning with flour on her hands and bread in the oven and the noise of Quartz Ridge's population eating breakfast on the other side of the wall, the supper hadn't saved the saloon. The people had. The supper was just a room and a table and enough food. The people were the ones who decided what it meant. She'd given the town a place to be itself. And the town had shown up. That was the thing about people. The thing you could forget if you'd been knocked around enough times by the ones who used their power badly, the way Cain did, the way powerful men in small places often did. You could forget that most people, when given a genuine choice between fear and something better, chose the something better. Not always, not unanimously, not without the friction and messiness of actual human beings deciding things, but mostly. Mostly, they chose the table over the wall. Greta believed this. She'd believed it before she had evidence for it, which was the uncomfortable truth about faith in people. It has to exist before the evidence, or it's not faith, it's just observation. Helen Brody came in on Friday as usual, earlier than most, the way she had every Friday for 2 months now. She sat at the bar and accepted coffee, and looked at Greta with the direct, considered expression of a woman who said what she meant. "I heard Kane withdrew the filing," she said. "Yesterday, noon," Greta said. Helen wrapped her hands around the cup. Frank said he saw Kane's clerk at the land office himself, filing the withdrawal. Frank was there for something about the grazing lease. She paused. He said the clerk looked relieved. "Probably was," Greta said. "It wasn't a real filing. Everybody in that office knew it." "That's how he's always worked," Helen said. "Not with force exactly, with the threat of it. Make people feel like the ground could shift under them any time he wanted, so they stay quiet." She was quiet for a moment herself. "People have been quiet in this town for a long time." "Not last Tuesday," Greta said. Helen looked at her. "No," she said. "Not last Tuesday." She drank her coffee. Greta refilled it without being asked. "What happens to this place now?" Helen asked. It was a real question, not rhetorical. Greta considered it honestly. "Same as before," she said. "Bread in the morning, soup at noon, family evenings on Tuesday and Thursday. The bar for whoever wants it." She paused. "We're looking at adding a Saturday afternoon meal. Eli thinks we could do a proper roast if we plan far enough ahead." Helen raised an eyebrow slightly. "Eli thinks?" "He has opinions," Greta said. "Good ones, mostly." "How old is he?" 11 and a half. "He'll remind you of the half if you forget it." Helen almost smiled. "Is he staying with you now?" "As of this week," Greta said. "Jonas fixed up the small room at the back of the second floor. It needed a window latch and a new mattress. Dale found the mattress from somewhere. I didn't ask where." Helen looked into her coffee cup. "That's a good thing," she said with a simplicity that carried more weight than a longer statement would have. "Yes," Greta said. "It is." On a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the supper, Jonas found her at the counter in the back kitchen, not baking, just standing there with a cup of coffee, looking at the oven. This was unusual enough that he stopped in the doorway. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Thinking," she said. "About?" She turned around. She looked at him. This man she'd agreed to marry 11 weeks ago based on a letter and a decision, and the particular pragmatism of someone who understood that you built a life from what was available, not from what was ideal. She'd known almost nothing about him then. She knew considerably more now. She knew that he was the kind of man who held the door open without making a thing of it, that he was better at physical work than he let on, that he laughed like someone who hadn't done it in a while and was relearning it, that he'd suggested Eli stay before she'd thought to ask, that the night of the supper, when she'd stood in front of 60 people and said what she'd said, he'd stood beside her without a word, which was exactly the right thing, and which she hadn't needed to explain to him. These were not small things. "I was thinking," she said, "that we should set a date." He was quiet for a moment. "For the wedding." "Unless you've changed your mind." "I haven't changed my mind," he said, quickly enough that she believed it. I wasn't sure you—" He stopped. Tried again. "When you came here, I wasn't what you'd have hoped for. I know that." "I didn't come here with hopes," she said. "I came here with a plan." "And how's the plan going?" She looked around the kitchen. The oven, the clean counter, the bread pans stacked in order by size, the biscuit tin on the shelf above the stove. She looked through the doorway at the main room, where Eli was setting up the morning tables with the efficiency of a child who'd found his work. "Better than projected," she said. Jonas leaned against the doorframe. He was smiling, the full version, still new enough to change his face, still the version that was better than the almost. "That's the most Greta Falcon thing you've ever said." "I mean it." "I know you do." He was quiet for a moment. "December," he said, "if that works." "December works," she said. He nodded. He looked at her for another moment with something in his face that was not the debt-worn, half-defeated man she'd met at the stage stop 2 months ago. It was someone she was still learning, someone she found she wanted to keep learning. "I'll put the coffee on," he said. "You'll burn it," she said. "I might," he admitted, and went to do it anyway. She turned back to the oven. She opened the door, checked the heat, closed it again. She thought about 11 weeks, about $42, and a letter from a matchmaking service and a cattle buyer on a stage who'd looked at this town like a diagnosis, about flour and yeast, and the smell that traveled down a street and changed the shape of a morning. About a boy in mismatched boots watching a loaf like it mattered. About 60 people reaching into their pockets in a frontier saloon because a woman from Bavaria had given them somewhere worth protecting. She thought about what it meant to look at a broken thing and ask what could be done with it, and then to do it, and to find that what could be done was more than you'd let yourself believe at the start. That was not a lesson anyone had taught her. She'd learned it the hard way, which was the only way it stuck. Not from advice or philosophy, but from flour and debt and the specific weight of a biscuit tin at midnight that was $14 more than enough. There was a sound from the front. Eli telling someone the soup wasn't ready yet. The someone saying that was fine. They'd wait. And the morning opened up around her the way mornings did. Uncomplicated and real and hers. She reached for the flour. She went back to work.